listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
Welcome to another edition of the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. I'm your host, Femi Abebefe. As always, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. And Michael, we begin with Phase 3 of the offseason program. 21 teams now starting OTAs today as guys are back. The veterans are now joining the rookies as we have football players running around on the football field. No pads, no contact. You cannot have contact at OTAs, but it's good to see the guys back at the facility.
Yeah, we get them going. I mean, this is a little bit of when most misevaluations occur. We have so many guys that are involved in, that look good without pads, look good without, one thing about football, is it run or pass? So when you take away that element, it's hard to evaluate anybody because, it's all run. It's like I love when scouts run down to the 9-on-7 drill with their notepads as if they're going to evaluate that drill, right? Oh, this guy's really good in 9-on-7. Well, he knows it's freaking run. I mean, of course he's going to be good. It's if you put the element of pass to run, and then that becomes an evaluation period. But look, it's good to have everybody back. I'm sure some veterans won't take part, which is probably a good thing. This is really the challenge of a coach here, Femi, is to figure out reps, right? You only get so much time on the field. You only get so much time in the classroom. This really takes a lot of meticulous work to make sure the right players are getting the right work. And when you have so much competition at positions, like let's take like the Houston Texans, when you look at their roster, right? They've got a lot of guys at a lot of different positions that are competing for jobs, right? And they're looking for reps. They need to get the reps. They need to get – what ends up happening is who decides on the reps, like who's giving out the reps and who's controlling the reps. And in most organizations, because the head coach isn't really involved in everything in terms of the overall planning, then that becomes a real issue, who's getting the reps. And then conversely, what makes it even worse is who's evaluating. See, Al Davis used to say this all the time, don't let the coaches become general managers. And what he meant by that was if there's 4 guys competing for a job at one place, like let's say, in Houston where they have a lot of depth, right? Like you're now asking the coaches to decide who's the best player when sometimes that's not necessarily going to be the right choice.
It's interesting because, as fans, we hear of OTAs. It's like, okay, they're back on the field. Like, how long are these? I don't even want to call them practices. Like, how long are these, activities or sessions each day? It's like a practice, but it's not like anything like what you'll see training camp or during the regular season. Like, how long are these sessions, and how many reps do guys get, realistically?
I think they're like 215, and so what you can do, and a lot of it is fundamental work. It's staggered just like a mini camp practice. Where you have a lot of individuals, and then you go into some team element, and then you make sure that you offense versus offense in terms of kind of route recognition, assignment, all that, and then eventually it gets to a team situation. But it's no contact. And you can have fundamentals and touch, but it can't be overly physical. And that's when you get fined. And then you basically have to determine, okay, how many reps does Mixon get? How many reps does Damian Pierce get? Who's controlling that? The running back coach, or is DeMeco Ryans controlling that? Okay, I don't really need to see Mixon here. I want to save Mixon. Let's make sure we give him Pierce and all the other backs, the kid Jordan they drafted in the 5th round, whatever, get them the reps, and we'll take a look at those guys so we can evaluate. A lot of this is who do we want to be able to get evaluations on in minicamp to then take those evaluations into training camp. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to have installing something during these OTA days. You're putting stuff in, new stuff that you're putting in that you're never going to use. I remember being at the Raiders where we were trying to run some stuff on defense, and then by the time we got training camp, the 12 OTA days we didn't even use any of the stuff that we put in at training camp. It was like, oh, okay, we're not going to use that. Well, that becomes a real issue because now what happens? You just wasted time. Things have to get coordinated when you go on the field.
Yeah, you don't want to waste these times. Like, it's not what you're going to do at training camp. But this is kind of the implementation process of what you should be running in the fall as we approach the season here. Once again, the teams can run 7-on-7. They can do the 9-on-7 drill, like the run game drill. They can do 11-on-11 drills, but of course, no contact. Nobody trying to. Let's keep guys off the ground. Let's get out of here with no injuries, and let's get healthy into the actual offseason and head to training camp.
You got to learn how to practice this way, Femi. Yeah. This is Walsh's genius. He taught his team how to practice without pads on. And those were physical. And, when he was one of the first guys to go to one a day, he really spent a lot of time teaching the 49ers how to practice without hurting one another, but still maintaining some level of physicality that goes into it. And that's really important. And you got to really coach that and no fights and do all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And, the rookies are going to try to make sure they get, like we talked about last week, they want more reps. But you got to earn the reps off the field. You got to be able to have the ability to know what you do when you get that one rep. You just can't get that one rep and say, oh, man, I don't have it, right? You got to have that, make that one rep count. You got to know what the hell you're doing.
Yeah, it's like the Tom Brady story that you told last week. It's like if you only get 2 reps, make those the best 2 reps of that day. Of make it like this is Game 7, this is the Super Bowl. Make those reps count for everything, and that's how you'll get more reps, and then you'll ultimately be able to compete for some playing time on the field during the regular season. The big news with OTAs. Tua Tagovailoa is attending the Miami Dolphins OTA workouts. Tua in a contract negotiation, probably going to be one of the highest paid quarterbacks, if not the highest paid quarterback. He's next in line for the contracts this offseason here. And Tua said he's planning to attend all these workouts during these ongoing contract negotiations. And there's a Dolphins team that is very optimistic, especially on offense, about what they can be this season.
Well, look, Tua knows he's going to get paid. Chris Greer, is all in on him. The disconnect between, why Mike McDaniels came in is because, Greer really believes in Tua. And it's interesting. I don't know how they run practice because when you really study Miami's tape, they're throwing the ball to Waddle, they're throwing the ball to Hill. And when those guys aren't in the game, they really don't. That's not the offense. If you're in fantasy football, right, you want to take Hill, you want to take Waddle because 80% of what the Miami Dolphins do is directed towards them in the passing game. That's where the ball is going to go to. So when they have OTA days, I'm not sure you want to run Hill. Beckham probably will be down there, but it'll be a completely different offense. I'm sure this will be more about Skylar Thompson and Mike White than it will be about Tua. But we know he's going to get paid, right?
Yeah.
We know that's going to be the case. And I think, to me, the challenge for Miami is everybody kind of has a read on what they're doing offensively, and they are really good, right? You can't play man against them because it's too damn hard, because you can't match up with Hill. You get caught playing zone against them. It's an RPO style of offense. That's where Tua succeeds at his best, right? And it's one look and throw it, and they're going to pay him $53, $54 million. You got to make sure that Hill stays around for a while. He's over 30 now. Waddle's still a young player. They bring Beckham in, which to me, they signed Jonnu Smith to be the tight end, which they rarely have anything involved with the tight end. But the one thing Smith does is give them more speed when they're in their base, when they're in their 11 personnel at tight end. So, in the 3 backs, even the kid they drafted, Jalen Wright, can fly. So they got 3 runners that can just fly. It's an explosive, but it all starts with the RPO. Read the thing. You know where he's going to go with the ball. It's a lot of spot drops. You know where he wants to. Tua's like a 3-point shooter in basketball. You know exactly where he wants to throw the football. Hard to stop, but you got to get there.
Yeah, they should send the Miami Dolphins skill position guys to Paris for the Olympics, honestly. They might be able to come home with the gold medal with Tyreek Hill and Waddle and all these guys, the speed that they have in the running back and wide receiver room. It's interesting because I consume football content year-round just because I love the sport and I love reading about it, listening and everything. Like all the football content, just give it all to me. And I saw an article yesterday talking about the way too early top 10 quarterbacks who could be MVP candidates, and Tua checked in at this list at number 5, which it's funny to see the list and how it plays out because it's like the first guy is obviously Mahomes, so it's like okay, it checks out. Mahomes, Burrow was 2, Lamar was 3, CJ Stroud was 4. Maybe people expecting that year 2 leap for CJ Stroud, which you understand that. Then you get to 5 at Tua, and I kept scrolling down the list. I was like, I wonder if Brock Purdy's going to make this list. And I'm not the biggest Brock Purdy person, but I can acknowledge he's a really good quarterback. And last year, he led the league in QBR, and his team is favored in all 17 games this regular season. I was like, How did he not make the top 10 list? No Brock Purdy, who was number 1 in QBR. No Dak Prescott, who was number 2 in QBR. Elliott's guy, Anthony Richardson, after 4 games, ended up on 7th on this list. It's kind of funny reading all this stuff and the expectations for people heading into a regular season where big expectations for Tua, big expectations for Anthony Richardson after 4 games in the NFL. Brock Purdy, maybe not so much. He's the invisible man.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's 31 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. I mean, it's just like
he was the most efficient quarterback.
It's all because it's somebody else. But yet, when you watch the tape, you can see that Kyle buys into him. I think the interesting thing about Miami, when you're handicapping Miami, and from studying them this offseason, I think this is really important. I think where you get into trouble, where Tua gets into trouble, is when he plays against teams that are really smart in the secondary. Because, if you can get a read on what he's doing and they have a really good ability to check and get the defense called correctly, when they play against a young team like Denver, when Denver really couldn't get lined up and they're screwing things up, and of course, you got to stop them. They're really good, right? But I think to me, when you're handicapping Miami and you're watching them play against a team with safeties that really are smart and know what to do and can check the defense, they're going to have a harder time when they play against a team that can't do that. Like Kansas City, I know it was a cold game on the road there, but Kansas City safeties were good. They could understand what they were doing. They got them in the right play. And I think to me, one thing is, for Miami, it's who's on the field. If it's Hill and Waddle on the field, they're throwing it to them because those two guys don't block at all. And if they're not on the field and they'll come out, they're probably going to run the ball. It's going to be some bubble or something like that. So when you can get a feel for it, and the more you study this offense in the offseason, you do get a feel for it. And you got to have a rhythm to it. It's going to be interesting what Buffalo can do because when Poyer and Hyde are healthy, that's the formula you needed. But they don't have Poyer anymore. They don't have Hyde anymore. It's going to be see how they handle that.
Yeah, the first 8 weeks, I'm looking at this, and to see if any of these teams fit what you're saying. They host Jacksonville and Buffalo to start the season. Then they're at Seattle, host the Titans, at the Patriots, bye week, at the Colts, and then hosting the Cardinals. Do any of those teams kind of fit in this smart secondary that could give them some problems?
I think Seattle would, if they get the calls and they've got veteran guys that know what to do. And once they get involved in their system, I think they could. There's no question about that. It's when they play the younger teams with rookies playing. This is what happened with Cincinnati. Cincinnati tried to play those young guys at safety, and it killed them. People don't realize they make the calls and checks, which helps the defense.
Yeah. Well, Seattle's now led by head coach Mike McDonald, one of the new coaching changes we saw of the offseason. We'll break down the impactful coaching changes coming up next year on the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
So over the weekend on our VSiN show, The Lombardi Line, we were discussing NFL win totals and hard schedules, easy schedules. And Michael, you'd have brought up the point that coaching is one of the biggest indicators for how a team will perform, whether they overperform expectations or underperform expectations. We've seen a number of changes, whether it's with head coaches, definitely a lot of them with OCs and DCs. And before we even break down just specifically which guys you like and which ones you think will hurt some teams for coaches that they have lost, why is it that coaching goes overlooked, and what is it about coaching that has such an impact on being able to tip the scale in a team, whether positively or negatively?
Well, I think a lot of it is the strategy that goes into the game, right? How the coach approaches it, how he handles it, then how he communicates it. And oftentimes, some coaches will just watch the last 3 tapes of the game and say, okay, I got this. Meanwhile, other coaches will watch what systems are similar to what they do that the other teams have, and then what adjustments do they make within the scheme. Everybody thinks you're coming up with something completely different or completely new. No, what you're doing is modifying the scheme to adapt to the opponent. It's a tactical warfare thing. It's the tactics, right? You set the strategy, and then the tactics come into play. Like, let's take, for example, Arthur Smith at Pittsburgh, right? One thing we know about Arthur Smith, forget what he was as a head coach. He's a really good offensive coordinator. Going to run the outside zone, inside zone, going to run a lot of play action, over routes. He got a lot out of Ryan Tannehill when Ryan Tannehill wasn't a great player. He leaves Tannehill. Tannehill wasn't the same player. So I think, to me, he'll put a better offensive structure in for Pittsburgh. He'll be able to attack the weaknesses within the opponent's defense. right? And he'll understand how to attack them. It won't be just we're running plays, we'll be attacking them. And I think that upgrade certainly will help Pittsburgh. And it goes on throughout the league, right? And so I think that's what you have to constantly look for is who's going to make a difference. I mean, Roman's run game at the Chargers will help the Chargers run the football. Now, if they get behind and they have to throw it, that may be an issue, right? Mm-hmm. Right? So, like, one of the questions you have to have about Miami is how good will Miami be defensively with Anthony Weaver and Joe Barry? Anthony Weaver's always been a front seven coach, right?
Yep.
He's never really worked the secondary. So it's the same thing. I mean, it's like DeMarcus Covington at New England. He's always been a front seven coach. Who's going to handle the back end? Who's going to marry the two systems together? And who's going to make sure the communication? You look at Mike Zimmer and your team at Dallas. You know, even though Quinn did a good job, the Quinn system and the Zimmer systems are diametrically different, right? And Zimmer on third down is as good a coach as there is in the league. Now, he and Paul Gunther will be really good. And I said this on McAfee the other day. You know, one of the things we're going to get out of Brady that's going to really be impactful is Brady's going to be able to peel the layer back on the coordinators. Because, like, for example, he's always had success, whether it's against a Zimmer or from the Zimmer style of tree, Brady knows the system. And so he can go out there and run it effectively. And he can teach America what you have to do to beat that system. And very few people really spend a lot of time on that, right? You know, that's where the good coordinators, that's where Ben Johnson has done a really good job. That's where you see the advantage. Just because you have the coordinator name next to you doesn't mean you're going to be able to do that. Mike McDonald in Baltimore last year, same thing. So I think, to me, that's going to be interesting to watch. And that's why the win total, football, you need great players, there's no question. But what makes the team great is putting the players in the right position. And practice execution becomes game reality. You know, how many times have you heard me say, if the play goes off the way they practice it, the quarterback looks good?
Yep.
Right. And there's some quarterbacks that can look good regardless of how the play goes. And I think a lot of that is the coaching that goes into it. So it's going to be interesting to see. And you got to evaluate the coaches. That's why the coaching evaluation in the weekly handicaps is critical. It's critical. And you have to study, like I was giving you the example, Brady playing Zimmer. You know, they know him. They understood him. Then the Patriots had it. The Patriots play in Seattle. They knew Pete's system. They knew how to attack it. Now, you have to block the front. I mean, but they understood how to attack it. You know, it's like in the Super Bowl 49. Once Seattle got tired up front, they moved the ball up and down the field. But because their front was so good, it was hard to move it earlier. It wasn't the plays, it was the personnel. And I think that's what you have to look at. And I think you have to really study that for the over totals. And you got to really make sure that the guy that they've appointed the coordinator can handle it. Because look what happened in Philly last year. Both guys couldn't handle the job.
Yeah.
And both guys couldn't recognize, more importantly, both guys couldn't recognize the problem.
Which has led to the demise of Philadelphia Eagles in the second half of last season and an embarrassing playoff loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. How long does it take? Like, does it go into the season, the implementing of these new schemes? Like you mentioned, Mike Zimmer taking over for Dan Quinn and how it's diametrically opposite the two systems defensively. Is this something that the Cowboys can pick up and hit the ground running week one, or is it going to take maybe week 4, week 5, once they really start to get comfortable with how teams want to attack them, and then they can adjust and they kind of get more of a feel for what the scheme is, different from what they've been used to with Dan Quinn over the last few years?
Well, no, it won't take very long because he's got Kendricks to line up the defense, right? And he's got to rely on Hooker, he's got to rely on Wilson, the safeties, to make sure that it's about 4 or 5 people they got to get communicated to. He's got Gunther on the staff, so Gunther already knows. So part of the problem, too, is when you hire new guys to be the coordinator, bring them in to run, is to convincing the old staff that the new way of doing it is good. It's kind of what happened in San Francisco last year. You bring in Steve Wilks, and you got all these other guys that have been involved in a different system, and Wilks is trying to incorporate, and then Wilks is trying to make everybody happy, and what happens? No one's happy. Right? And so that's kind of where you have to get people to buy in. It'll be interesting, like Kellen Moore comes to Philly, and Philly's line coach is outstanding. So how are they going to – he's just going to turn the run game over to the line coach, and he'll just handle the pass. But it's blending of that staff, right? Miami, you got Joe Barry going to handle the back end. Weaver's going to handle the front. How's that going to work? How's it? And because we know this about Mike McDaniel. Mike McDaniel ain't going to any defensive meetings.
Yeah, no.
He ain't going to any special teams meeting. He ain't going to any defense. He going strictly just to there. And this is what OTAs kind of leads you to. You got to figure out how this all comes together. And so while the scouts are out there evaluating the players, sometimes the coaching doesn't really allow for the player to really know what he's doing if the communications aren't great.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to bring all this up because we go through the entire offseason. Like the coaching changes happen right after the season, so it's around February or so. Then we get the combine and free agency and the draft, and we excuse me, like we sort of kind of forget all of these changes that happen. Like I sometimes have to remind myself that Kellen Moore is the offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles because it happened so long ago. We don't really like it all gets lost in the shuffle. What are the impactful ones? Because like we talked about these coordinators. How about the head coaches? Because Mike McDaniel, no longer the defensive coordinator in Baltimore, now the head coach in Seattle. Of course, now you have Gerard Mayo taking over in New England, Brian Callahan in Tennessee, Pierce no longer the interim. He was there last year, but no longer the interim, now the permanent head coach for the Raiders. And then in the NFC, the Raheem Morris to the Falcons, Dave Canales to the Panthers, and Dan Quinn previously in Dallas, now in our nation's capital as the head coach of the Washington Commanders. I guess, how are these impactful and how are these new coaches going to help their teams? And what do they leave behind? Are they leaving behind a big void? Maybe in the case for Dallas, with Zimmer replacing Quinn, it's not as big of a void. But I think about Mike Macdonald leaving Baltimore, and it's like, oh, how is this going to work out? Because he was a rock star defensive coordinator for the Ravens last year.
Right, and Zach Orr takes over. He's only been a coach in the league 3 years. So how's this? He's going to have to get a lot of help from that staff, right? Because trust me, you only coach 3 years. It ain't easy to become a coordinator and call games and call the game. Harbaugh's going to bring toughness. He's going to coach the team. Mayo doesn't coach offense or defense, right? Covington or this kicking game. They got 27 coaches now up there in New England. So Mayo's going to be in charge of morale, basically, and he's not walking into the defensive game plan and saying, "Here's what I want to run." Mayo's going to say, "Hey, I want to simplify everything, make it easier for the players." Okay. We know Callahan's going to run the offense in Cincinnati, and he's going to let Denard Walker run the defense, right? So, and then Pierce is the same thing. He's just going to come in. He's not going to mess with Pat Graham. He's not going to mess with Luke Getsy. He's going to come in and kind of coach the overall structure of the team. I would think Raheem Morris is going to stay with the defense. He hired Jimmy Lake to help him. Lake was with him at the Rams, so that's going to flow. Canales is coaching the quarterback because that's the most important thing in Carolina. I think McDonald will coach the defense. He hired Durden to be his coordinator, but I think he's going to be intimately involved. And the same thing with Quinn. Quinn hired Joe Witt, who was with him in Dallas, and then Quinn's going to handle morale, but he's also going to be involved with the defense. And so, the thing is, the challenge is when the problems arise, like who's handling the problems, right? Mm-hmm. It isn't about, everybody thinks you have to find the solutions, right? Well, the job of a head coach, and it's just like the job of an owner, is to ask the right questions. Don't be in search of the answer, be in search of asking the right question. Like, what do we need to fix? Because if you fix something for the game you're playing, it may create something for the next week's opponent. Like, how do you fix the whole thing? And that takes somebody really understanding all three levels of the game, and that's where you get a disconnect. And I think when you have continuity, like with Tomlin can oversee it. I'm not saying he's going to go run the defense or run the offense, but he can fix the problems to the best of his ability. And when there are personnel problems, it's hard. Like last year in New England, could Belichick fix the kicker? No. Could he fix Mac Jones? Obviously they couldn't. Or Bailey Zappi. So it became, sometimes the problems you can't fix. But then you identify what they are. If you can't fix them, you can't fix Mac Jones throwing interceptions. You can't fix a kicker missing kicks, right? You just got to get new players.
Is it better for a new head coach, like in the case of Gerard Mayo, he mentioned that he's going to be kind of a more overseeing and more on the morale side, similar to what Dan Quinn's doing in Washington. Is it better for that new coach, especially if they're a rookie head coach like Mayo, to kind of be more of the CEO role or also handling some of the play calling duties and be like, oh, I'm going to call the defense and also be the head coach, even though this is my first time ever stepping into this role? Like, which one is a better setup for a rookie head coach?
Well, probably the latter, because he can't coach everything. We're the age of specialization, so that's the case. But at some point, managing the game is going to be the most critical. The players are going to evaluate the coach based on how he manages the game, based on how he uses timeouts, based on how he handles situational football. And when that falls apart, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, no, that's something that I think that's going to be interesting to see with all of these guys. And I do want to continue this conversation real briefly on the other side here. We're going to run up against it on the break here. But I think just the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator ones are the ones that really get glossed over that are going to be really impactful. Like I'm thinking of like Vic Fangio going to the Philadelphia Eagles after what we saw last year defensively. You would think that's a big upgrade for the Eagles and their defense. And there's just interesting guys like Shane Waldron now in Chicago. A lot of eyeballs on Shane Waldron in that offense. Handling Caleb Williams, number 1 overall pick. What is that going to look like with the skill position guys that they brought in? Keenan Allen, they draft Roma Dunze, and they shored up the offensive line. I think these are all fascinating questions and stuff that we can all speculate about it, but we're not going to find out ultimately until they start playing games in the fall. All right, we'll wrap things up on the other side real briefly here as we will also remember a Raider great and just wrap up this coaching discussion here on the GM Shuffle.
You're listening to the GM Shuffle with Michael Lombardi, presented by DraftKings and VSiN. Here is Femi Abebefe.
There's a couple coordinator changes that I wanted to ask you about, Michael. First one on the defensive side, Jeff Hafley going from Boston College to now be the Packers defensive coordinator after Joe Barry. I know Big Daddy had his thoughts about Joe Barry, as did a lot of Packer fans about Joe Barry.
A lot of thoughts, yes. Big Daddy's mourning the Knicks lost. He's like, he's mourning the Knicks lost. I'm sure he could fix all their problems tomorrow. Yeah, he could fix all their problems tomorrow. Not a problem.
Is he going to get on the phone to get Mikal Bridges? Yeah, probably going to
blame Thibodeau. He's going to blame Thibodeau for playing the players too much. Everybody, Thibodeau wore his team out. That's why they got hurt. Okay. Anyway, look, I think Hafley's an upgrade. I really do. I think they needed somebody to change defensively. They got to get that front coordinated. They should not be as bad as they are against the run. They're big. They're physical. They should be able to play better defensively. I think there's no question about that. I think the interesting thing about Fangio is, one of the problems Fangio had down in Miami was I think that was a marriage that wasn't made very well. I mean, Miami we're going to go through it. The players kind of run the operation a little bit. And I think Vic wants somebody with, Vic comes from the accountability school and Hold'em and, that rubbed players the wrong way because the other side wasn't really that way. It'll be interesting in Philly. I think Philly, the way they practice and the way their conditioning seems to go away at times, I think it's going to be interesting how he reacts. Is Philly going to change that? How they handle that? We know Philly will be, when the start of the season, but as it goes on, some of the, the hard part about this whole thing, Femi, is the way some teams practice, like Cincinnati, Philly, where they're really kind of not practicing at a high level. Mm-hmm. It's hard to develop players that way. And when you need young players to come through, it's hard.
Yeah.
So I think that's it. Like Dallas, McCarthy and Zimmer, both old. I don't want to call them old school because that's unfair. Both of them understand the importance of physicality in practice, and practice execution becomes game reality. And I think that will go hand. I mean, Eric Washington in Chicago, that's Eberflus's program, so that's not really going to be the issue. Mm-hmm. It's when the head coach is an offensive coach who just wants to be able to get through practice without getting anybody hurt. That's when you get into trouble.
Well, how about conversely, when the head coach is a defensive-minded coach, now has brought in a new OC? I want to ask you about Liam Cohen, the new Buccaneers offensive coordinator. He's bounced around. He's been in that McVay kind of system, was with the Rams for quite a bit, went to Kentucky to be the OC there, and then went back to the he was last at Kentucky, I should say. I'm sorry. Yeah, he Rams Kentucky. Yeah. Rams Kentucky was his whole trip here, which is kind of strange.
He keeps leaving Kentucky. Yeah, wasn't he the guy with wasn't he the guy with Levis that was like Levis played good for? Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think Todd Bowles understands that for Baker Mayfield to be effective, he's got to be in in that run the ball really well. You got to run the ball. You can't have Baker thrown it 40 times. I mean, come on. They've got great skill players. Evans still looks like he can be a good player. So, I think that's the formula is built around the quarterback that they just paid. You're going to have to run the football. Like Clint Kubiak with Carr, right? I mean, that's going to have to be – now, this is a different system, even though you say, well, Kubiak comes from a West Coast. Well, it's a lot different than – remember, this was the Gary Kubiak system with Mike Shanahan evolved after Shanahan left San Francisco and then went to Denver. And then they kind of – came up with the outside zone and the play action and the hard play action, which Kyle runs, two backs, all that, which should help New Orleans. I mean, they if their offensive line can improve, that should. It's like Zach Robinson going to the Falcons and being part of that Super Bowl dynasty franchise down there, you got a chance to, you're going to get Kurt on a lot of play action. But remember, Kurt's about where his feet throw the football, right? That's all got to be handled, and you're going to have to adjust that through.
Yeah, no, I think all these coaching changes will eventually, we'll see what happens. Some of them will have success, some of them will not work out, and that's ultimately going to decide how these teams perform. But once again, the last overarching theme of this is, hey, you want to make sure you're understanding and evaluating these coaching changes, because that's ultimately going to probably help decide how these teams perform when the regular season gets here.
It's the most important thing any young coach can do, is to study the origin of the defense, is to study the origin of the offense, is to understand how the coach got to where he is. And then once you break that down, then the play calls, or how he calls the game, it becomes a lot easier for you. Once you understand what McDaniels is doing in Miami, based on who is on the field, based on where the ball's going, based on the RPO game, then it becomes, and see, so like Vic, if he had to go play Miami from practicing against them, he would really mess them up, because he understands it. They're throwing the spots. He can simplify the complex. Mm-hmm. And the only way you can really do that is by studying the guy. You got to go back and study the origin. That's why I wrote Football Done Right, because it's about studying because you're coming from basically 5 trees. And if you don't study those 5 trees, it's really hard to understand what you're trying to deal with. Like, these guys just didn't invent this defense. Like, the defense came from somewhere. The origins, why did they invent it? What did they do for the offense? Like, why is this all here? Zach Orr is going to take what he learned from being there and apply it. That's when you get dangerous, because there's only so much you've learned. So your volume of solving problems becomes so deleted, and somebody's going to have to help him. Yeah. Doesn't mean he's not a good coach. It just means when you remember, people confuse experience with expertise, right? And wisdom comes from learning. It doesn't come from years. It comes from constant learning. And how much time are you spending learning about the whole thing? That's why one of Ernie Adams' main jobs was to study the history of offensive and defense. And if you've got Ernie Adams on the call, he could tell you the origin of all these defenses, because that's what he did. He studied them. He was a historian of the schemes, how they evolved.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably one of the reasons why Kyle Shanahan is like one of the top tier play callers in the league. I know that people always talk about how he made sure to try to understand the defensive rules, because hey, if I understand their rules and their principles, I can attack them and challenge them and put them in uncomfortable positions and devise a game plan that challenges what they do defensively. It's like you almost, like, as an offensive coordinator, you have to be obsessed with defensive principles, and then vice versa, to be able to honestly be a really good play caller. Before we get out of here, obviously wanted to get your thoughts on the passing of Hall of Fame center Jim Otto. Mr. Raider left us at 86 years old. Wore the 00, which is, you don't see that anymore in today's NFL, but it's an iconic look for Mr. Raider. They called him Pops. Yeah. I know you wrote about Jim Otto in Football Done Right here. Just wanted to get your thoughts on it. Obviously passing at the age of 86, as we lost a Hall of Famer over the weekend.
Truly one of the toughest human beings that have been around. That face mask that he wore is iconic as well, right? And they should put that face mask on their jerseys as a patch to honor Jim this year. Really incredible. Was very close, was on every single trip, was a true Raider. He and his wife, Sally, went to every game. Unfortunately, he as his life progressed, the injuries, really affected him. He lost a leg. But I don't think I've ever seen a man tougher in all my life. He was as nice as could be, but as tough as could be. And I think that he really was symbolic of what a Raider should be in terms of the toughness, the grit, and what he did to himself to make himself a great player, right? This is a guy who's very undersized, got himself bigger, became a better player. Like a lot of these guys from that era, Mike Webster, Otto, they were not big enough to play in the game eventually when they first got there. And eventually they grew into it. Jim's from Wisconsin, went to the University of Miami. Webster was from Wisconsin, went to Wisconsin. But they're really remarkable. And the toughness. This is and the toughness was inherent. It was just part of their upbringing. It was part of who they were. That they had to face obstacles and deal with them. And he was truly, truly a wonderful man. Him and, to me, the team doctor, Dr. Albo, who is probably the nicest human being with the hardest handshake you'll ever have, were part of that culture that was really amazing.
Yeah, and I think I read somewhere that he came into the league around like 210 pounds, 205 pounds, and had to bulk up to like 250. That's remarkable stuff. 10-time All-Pro, 12-time Pro Bowler, in the Hall of Fame. We remember the great ones.
But a lot of these centers, Femi, were just never had a zero technique over them, right? Mm-hmm. And so the era was the Mike linebacker was over them. And there were two techniques, and there were the ends. And it was a static formation, right? Nobody moved it. And so because of that, it's like the Jets. One of the things about when you play the Jets, for example, because they're a static team, you can get Quentin Williams you can get him wherever you want to put him. And good offensive coordinators understand that, But when you move people around and when they're not a static team, it becomes a lot harder. See, this is also part of understanding the schemes. The Jets are static defensively. Okay, so now we know that if you wanted to throw the ball, you knew J.J. Watt was going to bat balls down. He was really good at it. So if you wanted to throw it to your right, you had to put J.J. over to your left. So you had to get in a formation to get him over to the left, so you're going to throw it to the right. You follow me?
Yeah.
And back when Jim was playing, there was no zero technique.
It's fascinating how the game evolves.
And then when Webster went to Pittsburgh, and then Webster goes to Pittsburgh, and all of a sudden he's got, Joe Green, and he's got Ernie Holmes lined up in a shade over him. I'm like, oh, fuck. I gotta deal with this guy right now? Oh,
But it gets you ready for the games. How was practice? I had to just block Mean Joe Green. That's how practice was.
Yeah. That's what Mike Webster. That's why if you read about Mike Webster in Football Done Right, that's when he went to the steakhouse and they went down in the boiler room. I don't know what happened in that boiler room, but everybody got stronger.
Well said. I was reading up on Jim Otto. One of his slogans was, "Never will they kick my butt." And that's, you talk about toughness. That's as tough as it comes. Obviously, we remember the life of Jim Otto, Mr. Raider, passing away at 86. Well, that does it for this edition of the GM Shuffle. Thanks as always for all the support. Keep subscribing, rating, reviewing. Keep smashing the like buttons on the YouTube channel. We see you guys supporting on the YouTube page. Keep commenting and engaging with the content. We really do appreciate it throughout the course of the offseason. For our producer, Elliot Bowman, with us on the ones and twos. For Michael Lombardi, we'll be back on Thursday to break things down. I'm sure we'll get some more news coming out. OTAs, 21 clubs, they're back on the field, running around, implementing their schemes, and we're off and running with the phase 3 of the offseason program. But Michael, I'll talk to you on Thursday, man. See you then.